There's a moment in every marriage where you start to wonder if the person lying next to you is really the same person you married. For me, that moment came after nearly a decade of what everyone around us would call a successful marriage. To the outside world, we were the picture-perfect couple. Nice house in the suburbs, a growing investment portfolio, vacations to Cabo every summer. You know, the kind of life that made people jealous, thinking we had it all figured out. But under the surface, everything was starting to unravel. I'm Michael, and I'd built my life on being dependable, the kind of man who plans for the worst and hopes for the best. I work as a senior financial advisor at a firm downtown, a job that requires precision, analysis, and an eye for patterns. Numbers make sense to me, people, not so much. Maybe that's why I never saw it coming, or maybe I did, but I chose to ignore the warning signs for far too long. Then there's Glenda, my wife. She's different. Always has been. When I met her, she was this whirlwind of energy, a force of nature with that wild black hair, always spilling down her back in waves, and those bright green eyes that could lock you in place from across a room. She had this magnetic pull to her. When she entered a space, people noticed. She was confident, ambitious, always chasing after something bigger. I think at first, that's what drew me in. She made me feel alive in ways I hadn't felt before. But over time, that same hunger for something more, something else, started to eat away at her, at us. And slowly, piece by piece, I watched as the life we built together began to crack. It started with small things I could have ignored if I was still the kind of man who looked the other way. But after a while, you start to notice patterns, like how she started dressing up more when she wasn't with me. Stilettos, makeup that took far too long to apply for a simple dinner with friends. And then, there was her phone. It used to just sit on the counter when we were home, notifications pinging without a second thought. Now it was always in her hand or face down on the table, screen locked the moment I walked into a room. There were late nights too, nights when she'd claim she had work dinners or last-minute meetings that didn't quite add up. Sure, we both worked long hours. She's an executive in marketing, always running from one pitch to the next. But these meetings were starting to become too frequent. When I'd casually ask who she was meeting or how long she'd be out, she'd smile that dismissive smile and give me some vague answer that felt like a slap in the face. Just some clients, she'd say, her eyes glancing away like I wasn't worth the effort of a real response. But I'd catch the slip, the way her hands tensed around her phone or how her eyes would dart to the door as if someone was waiting on her. You learn to recognize those tells when you've spent years analyzing people's nervous tics for a living. I knew something was off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just work that was taking her away from me. Still, I held back. I wasn't going to be that guy, the paranoid husband who accuses his wife of cheating without hard evidence. But the tension between us had been building for months, an invisible wall growing higher with every passing day. Our conversations were clipped, shallow at best. The kind of talk that filled the air but didn't mean anything. And our sex life? It was like trying to reignite a dead fire. Gone were the passionate nights that once defined us. Now, intimacy felt forced, like something we were doing out of obligation rather than love. It was around this time that Glenda got sick. Leukemia, the doctor said. A slow, creeping form of it, the kind that doesn't make itself known until it's already dug its claws deep inside you. I remember the day we sat in that sterile doctor's office, both of us staring blankly as the words left his mouth, like a slow-motion car crash we couldn't stop. We didn't talk about it much afterward. She didn't want to, but I could see it, the fear, the uncertainty that clouded her once clear eyes. It changed her, and it changed us. But it didn't change the distance. If anything, it made it worse. One night, I was lying in bed, watching her breathe beside me. She was already asleep, or so I thought, when I heard her whisper something that chilled me to the bone. I just want to feel alive again. She said it so quietly, like she was speaking to herself, like I wasn't even there. And that's when I knew. That's when I realized that whatever was happening to us wasn't just a phase or the result of her illness. It was something more, something darker. A few weeks later, she dropped the bomb. We were sitting in the living room, the air between us thick with the kind of silence that had become too familiar lately. She was nursing a glass of wine, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly, when she finally spoke. "Michael," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I need to ask you for something." I turned to her, expecting the usual. A request for help with something around the house, maybe talk about some new treatment option. But her next words, they left me reeling. I need to feel something again. I need to be with someone else." At first, I thought I'd misheard her. My heart stalled in my chest, a sickening wave of disbelief crashing over me. She couldn't possibly be saying what I thought she was saying. But when I met her eyes, I saw the truth in them. This wasn't a joke. I need it, Michael. Before it's too late. I stared at her, trying to process the words coming out of her mouth. It felt like some kind of twisted dream, the kind where you know something terrible is about to happen but you can't stop it. And then, as if to make matters worse, she said his name. Bob. Bob, our friend. The guy I'd known for years, shared beers with, laughed with. The same Bob who'd been to our house countless times, sitting across from me at poker nights while my wife was upstairs sleeping, or so I thought. The same Bob who had helped us move into our house when we first got married, who had become more like a brother to me than just a friend. I felt my chest tighten, a hot, searing rage bubbling up inside me. She was asking me for permission to sleep with Bob, like it was some kind of casual request, like it wasn't the ultimate betrayal of everything we'd built together. Why? I finally managed to choke out, my voice raw and strained. She didn't hesitate. Because I need to feel alive, Michael. This disease, it's taken everything from me. I don't know how much time I have left, and I can't go to my grave feeling like this. She said it like it was a need, like it was something I should understand. But all I felt was the deep, gnawing pain of betrayal. She wasn't asking for love or understanding. She was asking for my blessing to destroy what was left of us. And that's when I made a decision. She thought I would just swallow the pain, that I'd let her have this one night and then we'd move on like nothing happened. But no. If Glenda wanted to betray me, to throw our marriage into the fire for a fleeting moment of lust, then she was going to pay for it. Every step she took, every decision she made from this point on would play right into my hands. She didn't know it yet, but her little adventure was about to become the beginning of her downfall. The night after Glenda's little request, I couldn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundly beside me, like nothing was wrong. Her breath was slow and steady, the calm rhythm of someone without a care in the world. I, on the other hand, felt like my chest was weighed down by 1,000 pounds. My mind raced, replaying her words over and over again, each one stabbing deeper than the last. But I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. If she thought I'd just lie down and take it, she was sorely mistaken. So, I got out of bed. Quietly, so I didn't wake her. I walked downstairs, each step heavier than the last, the old wood creaking underfoot. The living room was dark, shadows from the streetlights outside cutting across the furniture. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, trying to steady the anger that was threatening to spill over. Then, I grabbed my phone off the coffee table. Scrolling through my contacts, I paused when I reached his name. Bob. His stupid, smiling face appeared on the screen, the picture from our last poker night. I stared at it, thumb hovering over the call button. The thought of dialing his number and confronting him right then and there tempted me. I could drive over to his place, pound on his door, and demand answers. But no, That wasn't my style. Not yet. I wanted proof. I wanted to know before I made my move. Instead, I pocketed the phone and made my way into the kitchen. The fridge door opened with a soft hiss, and I pulled out a beer, twisting the cap off and taking a long, bitter swig. It was cold and sharp, but it didn't do a damn thing to dull the fire in my gut. I leaned against the counter, staring out the window into the empty street. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, tired, worn down, but still very much alive. I wasn't about to let Glenda or Bob take that from me. As the night stretched on, I started to focus. There was no point stewing in my thoughts. I needed to act. So, the next morning, I made sure to play the part. When Glenda woke up, I was already in the kitchen, flipping through the paper like it was any other day. She strolled in wearing her robe, looking fresh and content, like she hadn't dropped a grenade into our marriage the night before. "Morning," she said casually, heading straight for the coffee maker. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone light. "You sleep well?" She nodded, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Yeah, actually." "You?" I looked up from the paper, meeting her eyes for just a second too long. Like a rock. She didn't seem to notice the edge in my voice, or if she did, she didn't let on. She just sat down across from me at the table, flipping through her phone like everything was normal. The tension between us was thick, but she acted like it didn't exist, like we were two strangers cohabiting in the same space. It made my skin crawl. I had to remind myself to stay calm, to keep my composure. This was going to be a slow burn. So I kept my tone light, steering the conversation toward mundane things, work, weekend plans, the usual nonsense. But underneath, I was watching her every move. That afternoon, while Glenda was out running errands, I decided to start digging. I went into her office upstairs, a small room she used for work when she wasn't in the city. The desk was cluttered with papers, notebooks, and her laptop. I felt a pang of guilt as I opened it, but the anger was stronger. It wasn't hard to guess the password, our anniversary of all things. I clenched my teeth at the irony. The desktop was clean, just a few files for her work projects, nothing out of the ordinary. I started browsing through her emails, glancing at each subject line. For the most part, they were routine, work-related, some online shopping receipts, and a couple of personal messages from friends. But one stood out. It was from Bob. My stomach tightened as I hovered over it, my finger itching to click. But I stopped myself. I couldn't let emotions get the better of me yet. Not without context, not without evidence. I exited the email client and closed the laptop, careful to leave everything exactly as I'd found it. Rushing things would tip my hand, and I couldn't afford that. No, I needed to be smarter than that. Instead, I searched through the drawers, looking for anything else that might point me in the right direction. Old receipts, notes scribbled on the backs of business cards, nothing too revealing. Until I found a crumpled-up card from a hotel downtown. The Hilton. I held it up, turning it over in my hands. There was no writing on it, no date, no details. But it was there, tucked away under some old documents like she'd forgotten about it or didn't think I'd ever find it. I knew the Hilton. It wasn't far from Glenda's office, and it wasn't the kind of place you just end up at for business meetings. Tucking the card into my pocket, I headed downstairs, keeping my mind clear and my face unreadable. I had what I needed to start piecing things together, but I wasn't going to confront her yet. Not until I had more. Later that evening, Bob showed up, unannounced, like he'd done several times before. I'd barely finished pouring myself a drink when I heard the knock on the door. For a moment, I considered not answering it, letting him stand out there wondering. But no, that would be too easy. Instead, I opened the door, wearing my usual poker face. "Bob," I greeted him, my voice level. "Wasn't expecting you." He smiled, that friendly, easygoing grin he always had. "Hey, Mike. Thought I'd swing by, catch the game with you?" I stood there for a beat, just staring at him, wondering how long it would take for him to slip. but I stepped aside, letting him in, keeping the tension buried beneath a layer of casual indifference. "Yeah, sure, come on in," I said, shutting the door behind him. We made our way into the living room, and I could already feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. I could feel his eyes darting toward the kitchen where Glenda was. She was just finishing dinner, moving around like nothing was amiss, her hair tied back in that messy way she always did when she was too tired to care. She greeted Bob with the same casual smile she'd give any guest, but I caught it, the subtle spark in her eyes when their gazes met, just for a second too long. It wasn't enough to confirm anything, but it was there. Something was there. We sat down in the living room, the game playing in the background while I poured us both a drink. The conversation was normal, boring even, just small talk about work, sports, and the usual nonsense. But I was watching, waiting. Every time Bob glanced toward the kitchen, my grip on the glass tightened just a little more. At one point, Glenda joined us for a minute, handing me another beer before disappearing upstairs to finish some work. The moment she was gone, I saw Bob relax, his shoulders dropping slightly. He thought I didn't notice, but I did. They were both playing a game, thinking they could keep me in the dark. But they didn't know I was already 10 steps ahead. I was watching every move, every glance, waiting for one of them to slip up. As the night dragged on, Bob finally made his exit, offering me that same easy smile as he grabbed his coat. "Good catching up, Mike," he said, clapping me on the back as he headed for the door. I smiled back, but there was no warmth behind it. "Yeah, Bob, good to see you." I stood in the doorway, watching him walk to his car, the wheels in my head spinning faster than ever. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As I shut the door, the silence of the house enveloped me. Upstairs, I could hear Glenda moving around, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. They thought they could play me for a fool. But the joke was on them. I wasn't just going to sit back and watch my marriage disintegrate. No, this was just the beginning of a game neither of them knew they were playing, and I wasn't about to lose. The next few days after Bob's visit were uneventful on the surface, but I knew better. Glenda was careful, more than she usually was, moving around the house with that same air of casual normalcy. But I saw through it, the small details. Her phone, which had once stayed glued to her hand, was suddenly left on the kitchen counter more often, almost as if she wanted me to believe she wasn't hiding anything. Her schedule, which used to be erratic with work meetings and late-night dinners, suddenly became more predictable. It was all too perfect. I wasn't buying any of it. So I decided to dig a little deeper. The hotel card from the Hilton had been burning a hole in my pocket since I found it, and every time Glenda left the house, I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was no way she'd just tossed it in her office for no reason. And if Bob was involved, then I needed to know. I needed confirmation. I waited for the right moment. Friday afternoon. Glenda had left the house, supposedly meeting with clients in the city. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she walked out the door, throwing a casual, "I'll be back late, don't wait up," over her shoulder. I watched her go, the front door swinging shut behind her. I didn't hesitate. Grabbing my keys, I left the house a few minutes later, heading straight for downtown. The drive was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound as I made my way to the Hilton, my mind racing with possibilities. By the time I pulled up to the hotel's parking garage, I had already mentally prepared myself for what I might find. Still, a part of me hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. I parked the car and walked into the hotel lobby, blending in with the afternoon crowd. The place was busy, tourists and businessmen alike flooding the front desk, checking in and out. I felt like a ghost among them, invisible as I scanned the room, my eyes darting to the elevator bank. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but my gut told me I wasn't far off. Then I saw it. The elevator doors opened, and out stepped Bob. He looked relaxed, casual in his jeans and a button-down, the same easygoing grin on his face as he made his way across the lobby. But he wasn't alone. Right behind him, wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, was Glenda. I froze. My heart didn't just drop, it plummeted. They were walking together, too close, talking in low voices as they made their way through the lobby. Bob had his hand on her lower back, guiding her toward the front door like he'd done it 100 times before. She wasn't brushing him off. She wasn't pulling away. No. She leaned into him, her lips curling into a soft smile as she whispered something in his ear. That smile. The one she used to give me. Rage boiled under my skin, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing it now wouldn't do me any good. Instead, I hung back, watching as they slipped out of the hotel, disappearing into the busy street like nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. I followed them, keeping my distance, weaving through the crowds as they walked together. They didn't even glance back, too absorbed in each other to notice me tailing them. The way Glenda laughed at whatever Bob was saying, the way she touched his arm casually, it all made me sick. They stopped at a nearby cafe, slipping into a booth by the window. I kept walking, circling the block before doubling back. There was a bar across the street with outdoor seating, perfect vantage point. I slid into a seat, ordered a beer, and sat there like any other guy just killing time, my eyes locked on the two of them through the window. Inside, they were laughing, leaning across the table, their heads close together. Glenda reached out, placing her hand over Bob's, her thumb tracing circles on his skin. The kind of casual intimacy that comes from knowing someone, really knowing them. And just like that, any lingering doubts I had evaporated. This wasn't just some innocent lunch between friends. It was all right there in front of me, playing out like a scene from some cheap romance movie. They stayed there for almost an hour, talking, laughing, oblivious to the world outside. I sat there, nursing my beer, my fingers gripping the bottle so tightly I thought it might shatter. My mind was racing, but my body stayed rooted in place. There was no point in confronting them now, not here in public. Not when I still didn't have the full picture. I needed more. Finally, they stood up, leaving cash on the table before heading back out into the street. I followed again, keeping a safe distance as they walked side by side. The longer I watched them, the more I noticed. The subtle touches, the stolen glances. It wasn't just lust. There was something deeper there. Something that had been brewing for longer than I realized. They reached Bob's car parked a few blocks down, and that's when it happened. Glenda turned to him, her face soft, her eyes full of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Desire. She leaned in, her hand sliding up his chest, and then she kissed him. Not a quick peck, not a friendly goodbye. No, this was the kind of kiss that left no room for misinterpretation. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer as they stood there on the sidewalk, completely unaware of anyone around them. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay rooted where I was, every muscle in my body screaming at me to do something, to storm over there and rip them apart. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not yet. They broke apart after a moment, laughing softly as they climbed into Bob's car. I watched as they drove off, disappearing around the corner, taking the last shreds of my marriage with them. By the time I got back to the house that night, it was dark. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket as I stood in the hallway, the weight of what I'd seen crushing down on me. I knew Glenda would be home soon, slipping back into the role of devoted wife like nothing had happened. But I couldn't look at her the same anymore. I couldn't sit there and pretend that our life was still intact when everything was crumbling right in front of me. I poured myself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as I tried to think, tried to plan my next move. The sound of the front door opening broke through the haze in my mind, and there she was. Glenda, smiling like she hadn't spent the afternoon tangled up with another man. "Hey, you're still up?" she said. her voice light as she slipped off her coat, hanging it neatly by the door. "I thought you'd be asleep by now." I forced a smile, raising the glass to my lips, just winding down. She didn't notice the edge in my voice, or if she did, she didn't let it show. Instead, she walked over to me, leaning in to plant a kiss on my cheek. The scent of her perfume filled the air, but all I could smell was the betrayal that clung to her skin. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone casual. I nodded, the words sticking in my throat. "Yeah, everything's fine." But it wasn't fine. It wasn't fine at all. That night, after Glenda walked upstairs to the bedroom, I sat in the living room, the glass of whiskey still heavy in my hand, my mind spinning in 1,000 directions. Everything I had suspected, no, knew, was finally confirmed. They were more than just a little too friendly, more than just flirting behind my back. This was an affair, plain and simple, and it had probably been going on for longer than I cared to admit. I could still see them, standing on that sidewalk, her lips on his, like I didn't even exist. The image burned into my brain. I wanted to explode, to confront her right then and there, but that would have been too easy. No, this wasn't going to end with me flipping out and her getting away with a simple apology. She was going to pay for this. Both of them were. But not yet. I needed to play it smart, wait for the right moment. I wasn't some impulsive guy who threw a punch at the first sign of trouble. I was a planner, always had been. So, as I sat there, I started planning my next steps. My mind was a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. I had to act without her knowing. I had to be 5 steps ahead of her and Bob, keep them both in the dark until I was ready to make my move. The next few days were a test of my patience. Glenda carried on like nothing had changed, still slipping into her work clothes, still heading off to her so-called meetings or client dinners. Every time she walked out that door, I knew where she was really going, and every time I let her go, pretending that I didn't know a damn thing. I kept busy. At work, I dove into projects, staying late at the office and making it clear I was unavailable during the day. At home, I made sure to keep up appearances. We'd have dinner together, watch TV in silence, sleep in the same bed, but it was all just a charade. A sick, twisted charade that I had to maintain if I wanted my plan to work. Glenda was good at hiding her betrayal, but I was better at playing the long game. But I wasn't just sitting idle. In the moments I had to myself, I started gathering everything I could. I pulled bank statements, phone records, anything that might give me more evidence. I knew she wasn't stupid enough to leave a paper trail. But Bob? He was careless. I combed through her texts when she wasn't around, looking for any message that might give them away. They were smart about that, though. Nothing obvious. Just the occasional, "Hey, see you later," or "Thanks for lunch." Still, I knew what those innocent words really meant. Then, one evening, a break came that I hadn't expected. It was Wednesday, and Glenda had been unusually quiet all day. She was walking around the house with that same distracted look, the one that used to make me think she was just stressed from work. Now I knew better. Around 6 o'clock, she came into the living room where I was sitting, watching some mindless TV show I didn't care about. "Michael, I'm going out for a bit. I won't be long," she said casually, her hand already on the doorknob. I glanced up from the TV, keeping my face neutral. "Where to?" She hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. "Just meeting up with a friend for dinner. Nothing big." I could feel my pulse quicken, but I kept my voice calm. "Which friend?" She gave me a quick smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't know her. Just someone from work." Liar. I watched her leave, the door clicking shut behind her, and waited. I gave her 5 minutes to get out of the neighborhood, and then I was up, grabbing my keys and heading for the garage. This time, I wasn't staying behind. I was going to follow her. I pulled out of the driveway, keeping my headlights off as I drove down the street. It was dark, and the city lights were just starting to flicker on as I trailed her car, making sure to keep a safe distance. She had no idea I was behind her. After about 20 minutes of driving, she took a turn onto a quiet side street lined with apartment buildings. My stomach twisted, but I stayed focused. I wasn't going to let her slip away this time. Glenda pulled into the parking lot of a small, nondescript building, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. I slowed down, parking a few spaces back, watching as she stepped out of the car. She didn't waste any time, walking straight toward one of the buildings with purpose, her phone in her hand. I knew what this was. I could feel it in my gut. I waited a beat, watching her disappear into the building before I followed, moving quietly, staying in the shadows. The building wasn't anything special, just a basic complex with a side entrance, probably cheap rent, nothing out of the ordinary. But to me, it was everything. This was the place where it was all going down. I stood just outside the door, my breath shallow as I listened. I could hear faint voices inside, Glenda's laugh mixed with a low murmur that could only be Bob. My chest tightened, anger swirling in me like a storm I was barely holding back. I didn't need to hear more to know what was happening, but I couldn't stop myself from inching closer, pressing my ear to the door. I've missed this," I heard Glenda say, her voice low and playful. There was a soft laugh, and then Bob's voice, smooth and confident. "You know I'm always here, babe." Babe. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel my blood boiling, my fists clenching at my sides. I had to pull back, had to force myself to take a step away from the door before I did something stupid. I could hear more movement inside, soft sounds, laughter, the creak of furniture shifting under the weight of their bodies. That was all I needed. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears, the urge to kick that door down and rip them apart barely kept in check. But that wasn't how this was going to end. No, I had to be smarter than that. I couldn't blow my cover. Not yet. I slipped back into the shadows, my hands trembling with barely restrained fury. This was it. The confirmation, the evidence I needed. I had seen enough. I didn't need to listen to any more of their sick little exchange. By the time I got back to my car, my mind was already spinning with the next steps. Glenda and Bob thought they were in control, thought they could get away with sneaking around behind my back. They didn't realize that every move they made was pushing them deeper into my trap. As I drove home, the plan started to take shape in my head. I wasn't going to confront her right away. No, I wanted her to think she was safe. I wanted her to believe she could keep lying to me, keep playing me for a fool. Let her sink deeper into the lie. Because when I did finally make my move, I wanted it to hurt. I wanted her to feel every ounce of betrayal she had poured into our marriage. And Bob? He wasn't going to walk away from this unscathed either. I had something special in mind for him. As I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I felt the anger settle into something else. Something colder, more calculated. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about taking back control. They thought they were in charge, but they were wrong. I was the one pulling the strings now. When Glenda finally came home later that night, slipping into bed beside me like nothing had happened, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with what was to come. They had no idea what was coming for them. I spent the next few days in a state of eerie calm, going through the motions while the storm brewed beneath the surface. Glenda acted like everything was fine, but I knew better. I could see it in her eyes, the way they flicked away just a little too quickly when I looked at her for too long. She knew what she was doing, and now I did too. She kept slipping out at odd hours, claiming she had work or plans with friends. Each time, I'd watch her walk out the door, my hands itching to grab the keys and follow her. But I didn't. Not yet. I knew where she was going. I knew what was happening behind those closed doors. It wasn't enough to simply catch them in the act again. I needed more. I needed a plan that would hit her harder than just some angry confrontation. I wanted to destroy everything they had built in secret, every twisted moment they thought they'd get away with. I wanted to break them both piece by piece. But I was patient. I played the part of the oblivious husband to perfection, cooking dinner, watching TV, asking her how her day was, acting like the Michael she still thought she had fooled. Every time she smiled at me or kissed me on the cheek before bed, I smiled back, knowing the truth was like a poison she'd eventually choke on. It was Friday night when the opportunity I'd been waiting for finally came. Glenda had been unusually quiet all day, that telltale nervous energy about her that I'd learned to recognize. She was fidgety, tapping her fingers on the counter, checking her phone more than usual. Something was up, and I could feel it. By the time dinner rolled around, she was barely eating, her eyes darting to the clock every few minutes. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice light, casual. "Yeah," she said quickly, giving me a half-hearted smile. "I'm just tired. Long week." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. "Maybe we could stay in tomorrow, have a lazy Saturday. It's been a while since we had some downtime." Her smile faltered for a split second. She hesitated, the fork halfway to her mouth, before quickly recovering. "Yeah, maybe. I'll let you know. I might have some stuff to catch up on for work." Liar. I didn't push it. I just nodded and went back to eating, mentally preparing for what I knew was coming next. An hour later, after dinner, she disappeared upstairs to shower. I heard the water running, the familiar hum of the pipes filling the silence of the house. I waited, watching the clock, my pulse steady. Then, as soon as the water shut off, she reappeared in the hallway, dressed a little too nicely for a night at home. Tight black jeans, a form-fitting sweater, and those heels she always saved for special occasions. "Going somewhere?" I asked, leaning casually against the counter, playing the part of the curious but nonchalant husband. She froze for just a second, her hand resting on the banister. "Oh yeah, I forgot to mention it earlier. I've got to meet a client tonight. It's kind of last minute." I raised an eyebrow, pretending to be surprised. "This late?" She smiled, that same fake smile she always used when she was lying. "Yeah, it's a late meeting, some big deal that needs wrapping up. I won't be long." I nodded slowly, letting her lie hang in the air for a moment before responding. "All right, don't stay out too late." She laughed softly, the sound grating in my ears. "I won't." With that, she grabbed her purse and slipped out the door, the click of her heels fading as she walked down the driveway. I waited a few minutes, giving her enough time to get a head start. Then, just as I had done before, I grabbed my keys and followed. The drive was familiar, the same route she always took when she was sneaking off to meet him. I kept my distance, letting the darkness cloak my car as I trailed her through the winding streets. When she pulled into the parking lot of that same apartment complex, I parked a few spaces back, the anger simmering just below the surface as I watched her get out of the car and walk into the building. But this time, I didn't stay in the car. I was done watching from the sidelines. I needed to take the next step. I followed her into the building, keeping to the shadows, staying out of sight as she made her way down the dimly lit hallway. The door to Bob's apartment was at the end of the hall, and I watched as she knocked softly, her head tilting slightly to listen for the sound of footsteps on the other side. When the door opened, there he was, Bob, grinning like the smug bastard he was. He didn't waste any time pulling her inside, his hands already on her waist as the door clicked shut behind them. I felt a wave of fury crash over me, my fists clenching at my sides. But I didn't move. Not yet. Instead, I took out my phone. This time, I wasn't just going to be the passive observer. I needed proof. Solid proof. I quietly made my way to the side of the building, searching for an angle. The layout of the apartment complex was basic, the windows facing the street not far from the ground level. I crouched behind a nearby shrub, positioning myself where I could see into the living room without being seen. The blinds were drawn halfway, just enough to give me a clear view of what was happening inside. It was sickeningly predictable. There they were, on the couch, her legs draped over his lap, her head leaning on his shoulder as they talked in low, intimate voices. Bob's hand trailed absent-mindedly along her thigh, a touch that was far too familiar. I could see the way she looked at him, the way her body relaxed into his, as if they'd done this 100 times before. And then, as if the universe had decided to give me exactly what I needed, I saw it. Her phone lying on the coffee table. They were distracted, caught up in each other, and for a brief moment, they weren't paying attention. My pulse quickened as I crept closer, staying low, inching my way toward the window. I pulled my phone out, angling the camera just right. I hit record. The video wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It captured enough. I got them laughing, touching, her fingers running through his hair. And then the kiss. The kiss that made my stomach turn. It was slow, deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. Her lips on his, her body pressing into him, and the way he responded, pulling her closer, his hand slipping under her sweater. That was enough. I stopped recording and slid back into the shadows, my breath heavy but controlled. I'd seen enough. The evidence was solid now, more than enough to blow this whole thing wide open when the time came. I walked back to my car, the rage settling into a cold, focused resolve. Glenda and Bob had no idea what was coming. They thought they could get away with this, that I'd stay in the dark forever, but they were wrong. So damn wrong. As I drove home, the plan was already forming in my mind. This wasn't just about catching them in the act. It wasn't just about confronting them with the truth. This was about tearing their world apart the way they had torn mine, and I was going to make sure it happened in the most spectacular way possible. I parked in the driveway, the quiet of the house welcoming me as I walked inside. Glenda wouldn't be home for a few more hours, and when she did come back, she'd have no idea that everything she had worked so hard to keep hidden was now in my hands. I poured myself a drink, the ice clinking in the glass as I sat down at the kitchen table. The rage had settled into something darker now, something colder. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about control. They thought they were in control, thought they were smart enough to hide their affair from me. But I was the one pulling the strings now, and when the time came, I'd cut those strings and watch them fall apart. I sat there, staring into the dark, waiting for Glenda to come home. The countdown had begun. I sat at the kitchen table, the half-empty glass of whiskey in front of me, the cold weight of my phone in my hand. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, thick and suffocating, as if waiting for something inevitable. Outside, the streetlights flickered through the windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Glenda would be home soon, but tonight she'd walk into something far worse than the usual indifference I'd grown so accustomed to showing her. My mind was cold, sharper than it had ever been. The video of Glenda and Bob, their lips locked, their hands roving over each other, sat on my phone like a ticking time bomb. All the secrets, all the sneaking around, were now captured in the cruel, unforgiving lens of my camera. This wasn't just about confrontation anymore. This was about destruction. I had the power to end her with a single text, a single push of a button. I'd already sent Bob a message. You should come over. Now. It was vague enough to pique his curiosity, but laced with just enough urgency to get him moving. The clock on the wall ticked, and my pulse remained steady. I was waiting for more than just Bob. Glenda was out there somewhere, probably kissing him goodbye, her lipstick still smudged from their encounter. Soon, she'd walk through that door, thinking she could slip back into her role as my wife. But tonight, that mask would fall for good. The minutes crawled by until I heard the familiar sound of tires on the driveway. My stomach tightened, but my hands were steady as I set my glass down. I didn't move right away, letting the tension stretch out, letting the moment hang in the air. The knock on the door came just as I expected, firm but unhurried. I walked to the door, feeling the cool metal of the knob under my palm. When I opened it, Bob stood there, his face a mask of casual confidence. He thought this was just another night. Maybe he expected a drink, a bit of small talk, maybe even a way to gauge how much I knew. Poor bastard didn't know I had him by the throat already. "Michael, what's up?" Bob asked, his voice easy, relaxed. He smiled, that same stupid grin I'd seen 1,000 times at poker nights and BBQs. "Come in," I said, my voice calm, controlled. I stepped aside, letting him walk past me into the living room. As he moved, I could feel the fury rising in my chest, but I kept it buried, kept it cold. He settled on the couch, glancing around the room like he owned the place. "Everything all right?" I ignored his question, sitting down across from him, the silence stretching between us. My phone sat on the table in front of me, the video queued up, ready to play. I didn't say anything right away, just let him sit there, let the discomfort grow. Before I could speak, headlights flashed through the front window. The familiar hum of Glenda's car engine cut through the silence like a blade. She was home. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes never leaving Bob's face as I heard the door open and shut. Footsteps clicked against the floor, and then she was there, stepping into the living room with the same casual confidence she always had after one of her little meetings. Her eyes locked onto Bob first, then flicked to me, and for a split second, I saw it. The fear. The realization that something was terribly wrong. "Bob?" Glenda's voice wavered just a little, like she couldn't quite understand what was happening. "What are you doing here?" I let the silence hang for a moment longer, before finally speaking. "I invited him." Glenda's eyes darted to me, confusion flickering across her face. "What's going on, Michael?" I stood slowly, reaching for my phone. "You tell me." With that, I pressed play. The room filled with the sound of their voices, the soft laughter, the stolen kisses. Bob's hand sliding under Glenda's shirt, her fingers tracing his jaw as they kissed like they hadn't a care in the world. The color drained from Glenda's face as she realized what she was seeing. Bob's expression shifted from casual to shocked in an instant. "Michael, Glenda started, but I cut her off with a look. "Save it," I said, my voice low and steady. "I know everything. The late-night meetings, the hotel room, the sneaking around. It's all right here." Bob stood up, his hands raised in a pathetic attempt at damage control. "Look, man, it's not what it looks like." "Shut up, Bob," I growled, my anger finally slipping through the cracks. "You don't get to play the victim here. Neither of you do." Glenda looked desperate now, her hands trembling as she took a step toward me. "Michael, please, we can talk about this. It wasn't supposed to—" "Stop," I said, taking a step back, putting distance between us. "There's nothing to talk about." I could see the panic rising in her eyes, the realization that this wasn't just another fight she could weasel her way out of. Her whole facade was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. Then, in a move I hadn't expected, Glenda's face twisted into something darker, something desperate. Without warning, she reached for the nearest thing, my whiskey glass, and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, glass exploding in all directions. I flinched, taken aback by the sudden violence. "What the hell, Glenda?" Bob yelled, backing away from her. "You don't get to throw me away!" Glenda screamed, her voice shaking with fury. Her eyes were wild now, unhinged as she turned on me. "You think you can just end this? I gave everything to you." I stood frozen for a moment, not from fear, but from the sheer shock of seeing her unravel like this. This wasn't the composed, calculated woman I'd been married to. This was someone desperate, someone who had lost control. "You destroyed this marriage, not me," I said, my voice hard, the anger back in full force. "This is on you." But she wasn't listening anymore. She lunged at me, hands flailing, aiming to strike. I grabbed her wrists, holding her at arm's length, trying to keep her from doing something she'd regret. She struggled against me, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with rage and frustration. "You'll ruin everything," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "You can't leave me! You can't!" "Glenda, stop," I said through clenched teeth, forcing her back. But she wasn't stopping. In a blind rage, she tore herself free and stumbled back, her hand reaching for the broken shards of glass on the floor. I moved to stop her, but it was too late. Her foot slipped on the smooth surface, and she went down hard. The sound of her body hitting the ground echoed through the room, and I froze as the jagged shards sliced through her skin. Blood. It pooled quickly, staining the floor, beneath her as she lay there, stunned and silent. "Glenda!" Bob shouted, rushing over to her, panic flashing in his eyes as he knelt beside her. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. This wasn't how I had planned it. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. But now there she was, bleeding, broken, the mess she had created spilling out in front of us. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911, my hands shaking as I gave them the address. I couldn't even process what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. This was the end. There was no coming back from this. Not for Glenda, not for Bob, and not for me. As the sirens wailed in the distance, I stood there in the wreckage of my marriage, knowing that this was what betrayal looked like: bloody, chaotic, and final.